In the early 17th century, the arrival of English settlers on the Atlantic shores of North America marked the beginning of dramatic changes. Changes that would forever alter the lives and destinies of the Native Americans who had inhabited these territories for generations beyond memory. The nuances of their relationships, the hopes and heartbreaks embedded in their encounters, and the legacies of adaptation and resistance, all these threads are integral to understanding the early American story. When the English first landed in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, their situation was desperate. The men who came were seeking fortune, adventure, and a new start, but they were unprepared for the realities awaiting them. Swamps infested with disease, hunger, and the intricacies of living in a land that was both unfamiliar and fiercely inhabited. The local Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful network of Algonquian-speaking peoples led by Chief Powhatan, could not be ignored. To these Native Americans, the newcomers were at first curiosities, then possible allies, and soon, potentially, dangerous interlopers. Early interactions were shaped by diplomacy and necessity. The English, ill-equipped to survive without local knowledge, quickly realized the value of forming relationships with Native Americans. For their part, Powhatan and other leaders weighed the possibilities of trade and alliance, seeking to integrate the English into their complex system of regional power. In these initial years, survival hung in the balance and exchange became indispensable. Among the most famous symbols of cross-cultural exchange stands Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan. While her story has been romanticized over centuries, records indicate she did play a role in easing tensions between the English and her people. Taken hostage by the English during hostilities, Pocahontas was baptized, married John Rolfe, a leading settler, and traveled to England as a sort of living advertisement for Virginia. Her story, however, is as much about captivity and adaptation as it is about peace and unity. Her brief life, ending just as she reached adulthood, reflects the complexity and tragedy that marked many Native English relations. Trade was the initial lifeblood of contact. The English had little to offer in terms of food or sustenance, but they possessed metal tools, glass beads, copper, and blankets. The Native Americans, understanding their environment far better, supplied corn, fish, and animal furs. This exchange was not merely economic, it reshaped both societies. Furs became a massively valued commodity to ship back to Europe, fueling expansion and increasing the presence of English settlements. Iron and brass pots, glass beads, and weapons filtered into native hands, turning old balances of power upside down within and between native groups themselves. Yet, trade quickly sowed the seeds of trouble. With each new delivery of weapons or tools, the balance of power shifted, while English hunger for land only grew. Cultural misunderstandings festered. Where the English saw concepts of land ownership, property, fences, law, the native people recognized land as communal, a living resource collectively cared for and respected but never possessed. These differences surfaced in endless negotiations and ultimately confrontations. Conflict inevitably followed. As the English population rose, their settlements crept outward, encroaching on Powhatan lands. The fragile détente gave way to violence, culminating in the first major uprising in 1622, when Powhatan's successor, Opechancanough, orchestrated a coordinated attack against the expanding English plantations. Over 300 colonists were killed in a single day, a tragic reckoning for years of encroachment and broken promises. Retaliation was swift and brutal. The Virginia Company, already teetering under mismanagement and bankruptcy, faltered further. In 1624, the English crown revoked its charter and took direct control of the colony, blaming what they saw as the failure of both diplomacy and defense. Meanwhile, a different religious and social experiment was unfolding further north among the Puritans. Landing in New England, these colonists sought to build a city upon a hill, a society governed by strict biblical principles. Initially, their relations with the Wampanoag and other local tribes were pragmatic. Trade and treaties enabled the Puritans to survive harsh winters and unfamiliar land. The so-called First Thanksgiving symbolizes this period of cautious cooperation, a fleeting moment of mutual need and relative peace. But the Puritans, like their counterparts in Virginia, were driven by an unyielding sense of mission. They believed the land was theirs by divine right, a blank slate upon which to inscribe a new Christian civilization. Their expansion, laws, and missionary efforts increasingly clashed with native autonomy and traditions. Tensions reached a flashpoint in the Pequot War of 1636–1637. The Pequots, dominant in southern New England, had established themselves as formidable traders and brokers. Unresolved grievances, contested trade, and the murder of English traders led to open warfare. The English allied with rival tribes, Mohegans and Narragansett, and launched devastating attacks. The massacre at Mystic Fort stands as one of the most harrowing episodes. English soldiers surrounded the village, set it ablaze, and killed hundreds as they tried to escape. The Pequot people were effectively broken, with survivors sold into slavery or absorbed by rival tribes. This conflict sent a chilling message to all native peoples in the region. The English would stop at nothing to secure their place. Though broken in some quarters, native resistance was far from extinguished. Over the next generation, grievances multiplied as English settlers swarmed across southern New England, fencing off land, imposing their legal and religious systems, and eroding indigenous independence. The Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, reached breaking point. In 1675, King Philip's War erupted with devastating swiftness. Native alliances struck settlements across Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. Entire towns were burned, hundreds of colonists died, and the English responded with overwhelming force. The war dragged on for a bitter year. Both sides suffered enormous losses, but Native Americans bore the brunt of suffering and defeat. Their crops and villages destroyed, survivors faced starvation or exile. Metacom was ultimately hunted down and killed. The war's aftermath saw surviving native peoples driven further from their lands, sold into slavery in the West Indies, or forced into shrinking, heavily controlled reservations. English fears and prejudices hardened, paving the way for even more aggressive expansion. Throughout all these conflicts, Native Americans met colonization not as passive victims, but as adaptive, resourceful, and resilient peoples. They negotiated, traded, fought, and found creative means to survive in the face of unprecedented upheaval. Resistance took many forms, from violent uprisings to the forging of new alliances, from strategic trade negotiations to quiet persistence in maintaining cultural and traditional practices under pressure. In the words of a 17th-century English observer, a document often shrouded in the mystery of its true author, there is a palpable sense of frustration and fear. They are a people not so easily subjugated as was at first believed, nor are they insensible to the losses they sustain. Their knowledge grows in the arts of war as fast as ours, and their grievances are not forgotten. This mystery document alludes to a broader, often overlooked understanding. The native peoples were not static or naive. They learned swiftly, adapting new European technologies and tactics, sometimes turning them against the colonists themselves. While open conflict is the most visible form of resistance, subtler forms, adaptation, evasion, cultural endurance, often had the longest legacies. Some groups moved inland, beyond the reach of English settlements, forming new communities with those expelled or scattered from their original homelands. Others intermarried with African and European newcomers, producing new identities and networks that persisted in the shadows of colonial society. Some native communities found ways to manipulate colonial rivalries, playing English, French, and Dutch interests against one another to preserve autonomy for a time. Adaptation and resistance then coexisted. Native Americans persistently sought to preserve their lands, cultures, and autonomy, even as settler societies expanded relentlessly. They adopted firearms and horses, reimagined their economies around transatlantic trade, and rebuilt shattered communities time and again. Their responses confound simplistic notions of surrender or defeat. Despite generations of violence, disease, and dispossession, Native American nations survived. Their languages, traditions, and philosophies carried forward in the memories and practices of their descendants. Colonial records, filled with words of conquest, underplay the quiet strength of resistance, the persistence of hope, and the wisdom of those who navigated impossible choices. The story of the natives and the English, then, is not just a tale of clash and collapse. It's a portrait of endurance and creativity amid overwhelming odds. A dynamic encounter that shaped not just the fate of Native Americans, but the very character of America, its contradictions, its challenges, and its quest for justice still unfinished. It reminds us, with each account of conflict and each document, signed or unsigned, that history's pages are filled with voices seeking to be heard. The tragic lessons and the persistent spirit of resistance and renewal echo across the centuries, calling us to listen, to reflect, and to remember.